the encounter and the injustice. The morning was perfect. One of those rare days when the world seemed at peace. The sun bathed the city in a warm glow, and the gentle breeze carried the sound of bustling streets and cheerful chatter into the spacious parking lot of the city's grandest mall. Derek, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm but commanding presence, parked his police-issued SUV in a spot near the entrance. Beside him, his son Malik, an 8-year-old with bright, curious eyes, sat clutching a small action figure in his hands. It was their special Saturday outing, something Derek had promised for weeks. "You ready for this, champ?" Derek asked, ruffling Malik's hair with a smile. Malik nodded enthusiastically, his small face lighting up. "I've been ready. Dad, you said we'd check out the arcade." Derek chuckled. "Arcade, food court, and maybe a little something extra if you're good." They entered the mall together. Malik's hand nestled safely in Derek's larger one. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with life, families weaving through stores, teenagers laughing in groups, and the smell of cinnamon pretzels wafting through the air. Malik's eyes sparkled with excitement as they passed a massive toy store. But before they could dive into the fun, Derek stopped suddenly, patting his pockets. "I think I left my wallet in the car," he muttered. He knelt to Malik's level. "Listen, buddy, wait right here by this bench. Okay? I'll be back in just a couple of minutes." Malik hesitated, his fingers tightening on Derek's hand. "You'll be back soon, right? Promise," Derek said, his deep voice steady and reassuring. "And hey, remember, you're braver than you think." Malik nodded and perched on the bench near the entrance. Derek gave him one last smile before heading back outside. Malik sat quietly, swinging his legs and watching the swirl of activity around him. He felt small but safe, comforted by his dad's words. Minutes passed. That was when she appeared. The woman emerged from one of the high-end boutiques, clutching a designer bag and exuding an air of entitlement. She was tall, her blonde hair styled immaculately, her gaze sharp and critical. She stopped abruptly when she noticed Malik sitting alone. Her eyes narrowed, scanning him up and down. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Malik looked up, startled. "I'm just waiting for my dad," she scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Your dad? In a place like this?" Her gaze darted around as if searching for confirmation. "You people think you can just loiter wherever you please." Malik didn't understand the venom in her voice. He shrank slightly but managed to reply. "My dad said to wait here." Her face darkened. "Don't you lie to me. Boy, I know you're kind, always up to no good. How dare you come to a place like this?" Looking like, she stopped. But the implication hung heavy in the air. Malik's heart began to race. He gripped his action figure tightly, unsure of what he'd done wrong. "I didn't do anything," he said softly, but the woman wasn't listening. Her anger escalated, her voice rising as she drew the attention of passers-by. "You think you can sit here, looking suspicious, and I won't do something about it? Not on my watch." Some people slowed down, glancing at the scene, but no one stepped in. The woman's sharp words pierced the air, and Malik felt the weight of every judgmental stare. He wished his dad would come back. When Malik didn't respond, she took a step closer. "Don't you ignore me. Boy, get out of here before I make you leave." I can't," Malik stammered, tears threatening to spill. "My dad said." She cut him off, her voice like a whip. "I don't care what your dad said. You don't belong here." Before he could react, she raised her hand and slapped the action figure out of his grasp. The toy clattered to the floor, and Malik's breath hitched. Then, to his horror, she grabbed his arm roughly, shaking him. The boy winced, struggling to pull away, but her grip was iron. "I'll teach you a lesson. You little, let go of my son." The words were calm, low, and deadly. They cut through the chaos like a blade. Malik turned his head to see Derek standing a few feet away, his face a mask of controlled fury. His presence was imposing, his uniform and badge now clearly visible. The woman froze, her hand still gripping Malik's arm. Slowly, she turned to face Derek. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to fear. She dropped Malik's arm as if it burned her. Derek stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You want to explain what you're doing to my son?" I didn't know," she stammered, her bravado crumbling. "I thought he was." "You thought what?" Derek interrupted, his voice hard. "That he was alone? That he didn't belong here?" That you had the right to put your hands on him? The woman backed away, her face pale. I didn't mean any harm, she said weakly. I was just trying to. Trying to what? Derek's tone remained calm, but his anger was palpable. Humiliate an 8-year-old? Assault him? The growing crowd now whispered among themselves, some recording on their phones. Mall security arrived, alerted by the commotion, and Derek addressed them with a steady authority. Check your cameras. Everything she did is on tape. The woman's eyes darted around wildly. I didn't know he was your son, she blurted out. As if that would absolve her. Derek's jaw tightened. And if he wasn't, would that make what you did acceptable? The silence that followed was deafening. The woman had no answer. She stood frozen as security escorted her away, her protests growing weaker by the second. Derek knelt beside Malik, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. You okay, champ? He asked, his voice soft again. Malik nodded, though tears glistened in his eyes. She said I didn't belong. Derek's heart ached, but he smiled gently. She was wrong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel that way. You hear me? Malik nodded again, a small smile breaking through his fear. Derek hugged him tightly, his strength a shield against the world. Around them, the crowd began to disperse. But the memory of what had happened lingered. And so did the promise of justice. Derek could feel his pulse quicken as he approached the mall entrance. Something felt off. He could sense the growing unease in the air, a cluster of bystanders gathering, their hushed voices carrying a strange tension. As he got closer, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Malik was standing rigidly in front of a tall, irate woman. Her face was twisted with anger, her gestures wild and threatening. His son's small frame seemed even smaller as he cowered under her assault. Derek's stomach churned as he watched the woman shove Malik back toward the bench, her words slicing through the air like blades. He moved quickly, his stride purposeful but controlled. A father's fury burned in his chest. But years on the force had taught him discipline. He had seen too many situations spiral out of control. As much as he wanted to grab this woman and demand answers, he knew that anger wasn't the solution. When Derek spoke, his voice was calm but carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. Let go of my son. The woman whipped around, her hand still clutching Malik's arm. Her face was pale now, her anger replaced by shock. She let go immediately, stepping back as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. Her eyes flicked to Derek's uniform, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process what was happening. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice trembling. Derek's eyes darkened. Didn't know what? That you were harassing a child? That you were putting your hands on someone else's son? The woman's lips moved, but no coherent words came out. Around them, the crowd had grown. Some people were holding up their phones, recording the confrontation. A few whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Others stood silently, their eyes filled with quiet shame for not intervening earlier. Malik moved toward his father, his small hands clutching at Derek's leg as if seeking refuge. Derek knelt down, his hand on his son's shoulder. You okay, champ? He asked, his voice soft now. Malik nodded, but tears rolled down his cheeks. She said I didn't belong here. She said I should leave. Derek closed his eyes briefly, fighting back the swell of emotions rising within him. He turned back to the woman, his voice sharper now. Explain yourself. She took another step back, her composure unraveling. I thought he was alone. He looked suspicious, sitting there by himself. I didn't mean suspicious? Derek's voice rose slightly, cutting her off. Suspicious for sitting on a bench? For waiting for his father? Or was it because he's black? Her face flushed red. No, I didn't. Didn't what? Derek's voice was low, deliberate. Didn't think before you acted? Didn't consider that a child sitting quietly wasn't a threat? Or didn't think anyone would hold you accountable? The woman opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. The crowd murmured, and a few people stepped closer. One man, a middle-aged shopper holding his young daughter's hand, finally spoke up. She's been yelling at the boy for at least 5 minutes, he said, his voice steady but disapproving. It was uncalled for. She slapped something out of his hand too. Looked like a toy. Another voice chimed in, a woman near the back of the crowd. I saw it too. She grabbed his arm. Derek straightened, his towering presence even more intimidating now. His eyes bore into the woman, who looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. You assaulted my son. he said, his voice low but cold. In front of witnesses. In front of cameras. The mention of cameras seemed to jolt her. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling, where the mall's security cameras were positioned, their red recording lights blinking steadily. It wasn't like that, she said quickly, her voice rising in desperation. I was just trying to. To what? Derek interrupted. Discipline someone else's child? Enforce your twisted sense of who belongs here. You thought you could act without consequences. By now, mall security had arrived, alerted by the commotion. 2 guards approached cautiously, their eyes flicking between Derek and the woman. One of them, recognizing Derek, greeted him respectfully. Chief Reynolds, he said, nodding. What's going on here? Derek gestured toward the woman. This individual verbally and physically harassed my son while he was sitting here waiting for me. She needs to be detained. The woman's face crumpled in disbelief. Detained? For what? I didn't mean to. Derek held up a hand, silencing her. You assaulted a minor. You used hate-filled language against him. That's harassment, assault, and a potential hate crime. His voice was steady, measured, and it's all under security footage. Right? He looked at the guards. The taller guard nodded. Yes, sir, we can pull the footage immediately. The woman's protests grew louder now, her hands trembling as she gestured wildly. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know he was your son. Derek's expression hardened. And if he wasn't, what then? Would that make what you did okay? The woman froze, her mouth hanging open. The weight of his words settled heavily over the crowd. For the first time, she seemed to realize there was no escape. The guards gently took her by the arms, leading her away as she sputtered weak apologies. The crowd parted to let them through, some people muttering under their breath as she passed. Derek turned back to Malik, kneeling again to meet his son's eyes. It's over now, he said gently. You're safe. Malik nodded, but his small hands still clung tightly to Derek's arm. Why did she hate me? Dad? He asked softly. I didn't do anything. Derek's chest ached. He pulled Malik into a hug, holding him close. She doesn't know you, champ, he said quietly. She doesn't know how kind and smart and brave you are. Some people let their ignorance and fear control them, but that doesn't mean you ever let them make you feel small. Malik nodded into his father's shoulder, his grip finally loosening. Derek stood, keeping his arm around his son as they turned toward the crowd. The bystanders were silent now, some looking ashamed, others still recording. Derek scanned their faces, his voice steady but firm. When you see something wrong, he said, his voice carrying across the group, you step up. You don't stand by and watch. That's how we make things better. With that, he guided Malik toward the food court, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Justice would follow, the security footage, the witnesses, and the law would see to that. But in that moment, all Derek cared about was making sure his son felt safe, loved, and proud of who he was. As they walked away, Malik looked up at his father, his eyes filled with quiet determination. I'm glad you're my dad, he said simply. Derek smiled, ruffling his hair. And I'm proud you're my son. Revelation and consequences. The car ride home was unusually quiet. Malik sat in the passenger seat, clutching his action figure tightly. Derek glanced at his son from the corner of his eye, his heart heavy. Malik wasn't the same bright-eyed boy who had skipped into the mall hours earlier. His silence spoke volumes. The questions he had asked, why she hated him, why she said he didn't belong, kept echoing in Derek's mind. As they pulled into the driveway, Derek parked but didn't get out immediately. Instead, he turned toward Malik, his voice gentle but firm. Listen, champ, what happened today? That wasn't your fault. You did everything right. Malik didn't look up, but I didn't feel brave. Dad, I just felt small. Derek's chest tightened. He reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are, and you did that today. Malik finally looked up, his eyes searching his father's face. Did people treat you like that when you were my age? Derek hesitated. He wanted to protect his son from the weight of his own past. But he also knew Malik deserved honesty. Sometimes, yeah, he admitted, when I was a kid, I dealt with people like her. And even as a grown man, wearing this uniform, there are still people who think I don't belong. But you know what I do? Malik shook his head. I proved them wrong, Derek said, his voice steady. Every day. by being the best version of myself. That's how we win. Malik nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of his father's words. Derek ruffled his son's hair, a small smile breaking through the tension. Now, how about some pizza? I'm starving. That night, while Malik slept, Derek sat at the dining table with his laptop. He reviewed the mall's security footage, which had been sent to him by the security team. Watching the woman's actions again, her venomous words, her physical aggression, fueled a quiet rage within him. He knew this wasn't just about his son. It was about every child who had ever been made to feel less than. Every parent who had watched their child suffer because of someone else's hatred. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't over. The next morning, Derek was back in uniform, standing in his office at the police station. The woman, identified as Patricia Myers, had been brought in for questioning the night before. Her initial bravado had quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence against her. Now, Derek prepared to face her directly. As he entered the interrogation room, Patricia sat at the table, her once pristine appearance disheveled. She looked up at Derek with a mix of fear and defiance. The tension in the room was palpable. "Good morning, Ms. Myers," Derek began, his tone professional but firm. "I believe you know why you're here." Patricia crossed her arms, her voice defensive. "I've already explained. I didn't mean to hurt the boy. It was a misunderstanding." Derek sat down across from her, his eyes steady. "A misunderstanding? You yelled at him, physically grabbed him, and humiliated him in public. That's not a misunderstanding, Ms. Myers. That's assault." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I thought he was loitering. I didn't realize he was." "Didn't realize he was what?" Derek leaned forward slightly. "Human? Deserving of respect?" Her face flushed, but she didn't answer. Derek continued, his voice measured. "Ms. Myers, you targeted my son because of the color of his skin. You made assumptions about him without knowing a single thing about him. And you didn't stop there. You put your hands on him. That's unacceptable." Patricia's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she muttered. Just what?" Derek interrupted, his voice sharp. "Thought no one would hold you accountable? Thought he didn't have someone looking out for him?" Silence filled the room. Patricia's gaze dropped to the table, her defiance faltering. Derek studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You're facing charges for assault and harassment. And given the language you used, there's a strong case for a hate crime." Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "A hate crime? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious, Ms. Myers," Derek said calmly. "This isn't just about my son. It's about making sure people like you understand there are consequences for your actions." Patricia's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said weakly. I wasn't thinking." Derek's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained. "You weren't thinking about the harm you were causing. But that doesn't erase the harm. My son will carry this with him for the rest of his life. And you need to take responsibility for that." The following days were a whirlwind. The story of what had happened at the mall spread quickly. Fueled by social media, videos of the confrontation had gone viral, drawing national attention. Some commentators praised Derek for his calm handling of the situation, while others used the incident to spark broader conversations about racism and accountability. At home, Malik was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Derek shielded him as much as possible, limiting his exposure to the news and ensuring he stayed focused on school and the simple joys of childhood. But Derek couldn't ignore the flood of messages pouring in, from parents, activists, and even former victims of discrimination. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a mother in another state whose son had faced similar harassment. "Thank you," the letter read, "for standing up not just for your son, but for all our children. You gave us hope." Derek read the letter aloud to Malik that evening. When he finished, Malik looked up at him, his eyes wide. "Did I really help other kids, Dad?" Derek smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "You did, champ, just by being you." The case against Patricia Myers moved forward, with Derek determined to see justice served. During the preliminary hearing, the prosecution presented the mall's security footage, along with testimony from witnesses. Patricia's lawyer tried to downplay her actions, arguing that she had acted out of concern, not malice, but the evidence was undeniable. As Derek watched the proceedings, He couldn't help but think about the larger implications of the case. This wasn't just about one woman's actions. It was about confronting the prejudice that allowed such actions to happen in the first place. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was ready for the fight. And so was Malik. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Malik turned to his father with a newfound confidence. "I want to be like you when I grow up. Dad, I want to help people." Derek's heart swelled with pride. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You already are, son, you already are." To Derek, the fight for justice wasn't just a professional duty, it was personal. And with Malik by his side, he knew they would face whatever came next. Together the courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filed into the wooden pews, their eyes scanning the room. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of a desire to see justice done. The case had garnered national attention, sparking debates on racism, privilege, and accountability. Reporters were stationed outside, their cameras trained on the courthouse steps. Inside, Derek sat quietly with Malik, who clutched his father's hand tightly. Derek had debated whether to bring his son, but Malik had insisted. "I want to see what happens," he'd said firmly. "I want to know it's not my fault." Derek had nodded, understanding his son's need for closure. Across the room, Patricia Myers sat at the defense table, her once haughty demeanor replaced by a nervous stiffness. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering to her, but she kept glancing toward Derek and Malik, her gaze darting away whenever it lingered too long. The judge entered, and the courtroom settled into a tense silence. The prosecutor, a sharp-witted woman named Angela Lopez, rose to make her opening statement. "Your Honor, this case is about more than one woman's actions. It's about accountability." Patricia Myers verbally and physically assaulted an 8-year-old boy because of the color of his skin. She made assumptions about him, humiliated him, and used her power to intimidate a defenseless child. "Today, we will prove that her actions were not just unacceptable but unlawful." Lopez's words hung in the air, and Derek felt Malik's grip tighten on his hand. He gave his son a reassuring squeeze, silently willing him to stay strong. The testimonies, one by one, witnesses were called to the stand. The mall security officer testified first, detailing the security footage and the behavior they observed. "We saw Ms. Myers approach the boy aggressively," the officer said, his voice steady. "She slapped an object out of his hand and physically grabbed him. Her tone was hostile, and her words included racial slurs." The footage was played for the court. Gasps rippled through the room as the video showed Patricia's towering figure looming over Malik, her voice audible even without subtitles. Malik winced as he heard her words again, but Derek kept a steady hand on his shoulder. The defense attorney tried to minimize the damage. "Would you say Ms. Myers seemed agitated? Perhaps concerned for safety?" The officer's response was swift. "No, sir. Her actions didn't reflect concern. They reflected aggression and bias." Next, Angela Lopez called Derek to the stand. As he took his oath, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Derek's presence was commanding yet calm, and his voice carried the weight of his experience and pain. "Mr. Reynolds," Lopez began, "can you describe what you witnessed upon returning to the mall that day?" Derek recounted the moment he saw Patricia gripping his son's arm, her voice raised in anger. "I saw fear in my son's eyes," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "No child should ever have to feel that way." When the defense lawyer cross-examined him, they tried to redirect the narrative. "Chief Reynolds, don't you think Ms. Myers could have simply been mistaken? Perhaps she thought your son needed help." Derek's eyes locked onto the lawyer. If she thought he needed help, she wouldn't have used racial slurs. She wouldn't have grabbed him or humiliated him in public. Her actions weren't about helping anyone, they were about power. Malik takes the stand. The courtroom grew even quieter when Malik was called to testify. Derek had been hesitant, but Malik had insisted, his voice shaking but determined. "I want them to hear me. Dad, I want them to know what happened." As Malik climbed into the witness chair, his small frame seemed almost swallowed by the size of it. The judge gave him a kind smile, and Lopez approached gently. "Malik, can you tell us what happened that day?" Malik's voice was soft but clear. He described waiting for his dad, how the woman approached him, and the things she said. His words painted a vivid picture of the fear and confusion he felt. "She said I didn't belong there," Malik said, his voice trembling. "She said people like me shouldn't be in a place like that." Lopez nodded, her expression empathetic. "And how did that make you feel, Malik?" Malik hesitated, glancing at his father before answering. "It made me feel like I was nothing. Like I didn't matter." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Derek felt his throat tighten. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. The defense lawyer's cross-examination was brief, but Derek could feel his anger simmering as they tried to discredit Malik's memory. "Malik, you were scared that day, weren't you? Could it be that you misunderstood what Ms. Myers said?" Malik straightened in his chair, his young face resolute. "No, I know what she said. And I know she was mean." The turning point. As the trial progressed, Patricia Myers took the stand in her own defense. Her lawyer coached her to appear remorseful, but her words rang hollow. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, her voice trembling. I thought the boy was alone. And I didn't want any trouble." Lopez pounced on her admission. "You didn't want trouble, yet you created it. You assumed an 8-year-old was a threat." "Why?" Patricia faltered, her rehearsed responses unraveling under the pressure. I wasn't thinking clearly," she stammered. Lopez's voice grew sharper. "Or were you thinking exactly what you've always thought? That a black child in a mall didn't belong?" The court erupted in murmurs, silenced only by the judge's gavel. Patricia's face reddened, and she glanced nervously at the jury, realizing the damage her words had done. The verdict. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. Derek sat with Malik, his arm wrapped protectively around his son. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of everyone's eyes on the jury as they filed back in. The foreperson stood, her expression neutral as she read the verdict. "On the charges of assault, harassment, and committing a hate crime, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Malik squeezed his father's hand, relief washing over his face. Patricia slumped in her seat, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Derek shielded Malik from the chaos. "We did it, Dad," Malik said quietly as they walked to their car. Derek smiled down at his son, his pride immeasurable. "No, champ, you did it. You were brave, and you stood up for what was right." The aftermath. The case became a national touchstone, sparking conversations about systemic bias and the importance of accountability. Derek used his platform to advocate for education and community reform, hoping to prevent other children from experiencing what Malik had endured. At home, Malik began to heal. He started speaking with newfound confidence, his resilience inspiring everyone around him. One night, as they sat on the porch, Malik turned to his father. "Do you think she'll ever change?" he asked. Derek thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I hope so," he said, "but even if she doesn't, the world will, because of people like you." Malik smiled, leaning into his father's side. "Then I'll keep trying," and Derek knew he would. Together, they would keep fighting for justice, for understanding, and for a world where every child felt they belonged. The courtroom felt heavier than it should have for a bright morning. The light filtered through tall windows, but its warmth didn't penetrate the tense atmosphere inside. Every bench was filled, spectators leaning forward as if trying to catch the words before they were spoken. The hum of whispers died down the moment Derek Reynolds walked in. Malik beside him. Derek's tall frame, clad in his crisp police uniform, projected authority and composure, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. Malik's hand clutched his father's tightly, his knuckles white, as Derek guided Malik to their seats. Reporters near the back clicked their pens, ready to capture every detail. This was no ordinary case, it was a reckoning. The build-up to the trial. In the days following Patricia Myers' arrest, the case became a flashpoint. The footage from the mall, showing her towering over Malik and shouting, had gone viral. News anchors debated the implications on live television, panelists arguing whether her actions stemmed from ignorance, entitlement, or outright hate. Social media exploded with hashtags, some demanding justice, others dismissing the event as overblown. Derek avoided most of it. His focus remained on preparing for the trial and helping Malik process what had happened. At home, their routine shifted. Malik became quieter, more reserved, his laughter less frequent. Derek tried to draw him out, but he knew the scars ran deep. One evening, as Derek tucked Malik into bed, The boy spoke up. Dad, what if people don't believe me? Derek sat on the edge of the bed, his heart aching at the vulnerability in Malik's voice. They'll believe you because the truth is on your side, he said, and even if some don't, we'll stand strong, together. Malik nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. The courtroom drama begins. The courtroom fell silent as the trial began. Patricia Myers sat stiffly at the defense table, her lawyer flipping through a thick stack of papers. She had tried to avoid the trial entirely, but Derek had insisted on pursuing the charges. This wasn't just about Malik, it was about sending a message. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, addressed the court. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Patricia Myers on charges of assault, harassment, and committing a hate crime. Prosecution, you may begin. Angela Lopez, the prosecutor, stood with an air of confidence that commanded attention. She was known for her tenacity and had taken the case with a personal sense of duty. Your Honor, Lopez began, pacing in front of the jury. This case is about more than just words or actions. It's about the systemic bias that allows people like Ms. Myers to feel justified in their behavior. It's about accountability. And today, we will prove that her actions were not only morally reprehensible but also criminal. Patricia shifted in her seat, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. Derek watched her carefully, noting the way her fingers tapped nervously against the table. Derek on the stand. When Derek was called to testify, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. He adjusted his tie and approached the witness stand with measured steps. After being sworn in, he sat tall, his hands folded on the wooden ledge. Chief Reynolds, Lopez began. Can you describe the events of that day? Derek's voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of his emotions. He recounted leaving Malik at the bench, returning to find Patricia yelling, and the look of fear on his son's face. It's a look no parent ever wants to see, he said, his voice tightening, and it's a look no child should ever have. The jury listened intently, some nodding subtly, but the defense attorney, a middle-aged man with a smooth demeanor, was ready to challenge him. Chief Reynolds, the lawyer began. You've served as a police officer for many years. Would you say you're trained to handle high-stress situations? Yes, Derek replied, his tone even. Then wouldn't you agree that Ms. Myers may have simply been reacting out of concern? Perhaps she perceived your son as being in danger or lost? Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. If she was concerned, she could have asked him if he needed help. Instead, she yelled, insulted him, and physically grabbed him. That's not concern, that's intimidation. The lawyer hesitated but pressed on. Is it possible she didn't realize the impact of her words? Derek leaned forward slightly. She knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't see my son as a child. She saw him as a threat. And she acted on that bias. The courtroom murmured, and the judge banged her gavel for silence. Malik's moment of bravery. When Malik was called to testify, Derek's heart pounded. He had prepared his son as best as he could. But nothing could shield Malik from the pressure of the moment. Malik climbed into the witness chair, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing furniture. The judge gave him a kind smile, but the room's intensity was palpable. Malik, Lopez began gently. Can you tell us what happened that day? Malik hesitated, glancing at his father, who nodded reassuringly. Taking a deep breath, Malik recounted the events. His voice was soft but steady, growing stronger as he spoke. She told me I didn't belong there. She said I was a bad person. But I wasn't doing anything wrong. Lopez knelt slightly to meet his gaze. How did that make you feel? Malik's lips quivered, but he spoke with quiet determination. It made me feel like I was invisible. Like I wasn't good enough. Derek clenched his fists under the table, his heart breaking all over again. When the defense attorney cross-examined Malik, Derek's protective instincts flared. The lawyer tried to sow doubt, asking if Malik might have misunderstood Patricia's intentions. But Malik's response was unwavering. She was mean, Malik said firmly. I know what I heard. The defense's last stand. Patricia Myers took the stand reluctantly, her polished appearance a stark contrast to her shaken demeanor. Her lawyer guided her through a rehearsed narrative, painting her as a misunderstood woman who acted out of misplaced concern. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Patricia said, her voice trembling. I thought the boy was alone. I didn't want trouble. Lopez didn't let her off the hook. Ms. Myers, did you use racial slurs when addressing the boy? Patricia hesitated. her gaze darting to her lawyer. I don't remember. Lopez's eyes hardened. Would you like me to play the footage again to refresh your memory? Patricia shrank in her seat, her facade cracking. The jury watched closely, their expressions unreadable. The verdict. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for hours. Derek sat beside Malik, who had fallen asleep with his head on his father's shoulder. The weight was agonizing, but Derek remained outwardly calm, a pillar of strength for his son. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in her hands. On the charges of assault, harassment, and committing a hate crime, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhale filled the courtroom. Patricia's face crumpled, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. Derek closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over him. Justice had been served, a new beginning. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but Derek shielded Malik from the chaos. As they walked to the car, Malik looked up at his father. Does this mean it's over? Derek smiled softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. It means we've taken a step forward. And sometimes, that's how change begins. The trial had been a battle, but it was more than just a legal victory. It was a statement, a declaration that hate would not go unchecked and that even the smallest voices deserved to be heard. For Derek and Malik, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by fear, but by hope. Together, they would keep moving forward, proving to the world that they belonged everywhere they chose to stand justice and redemption. The trial may have ended, but the ripples it created were far from settling. Derek Reynolds knew that the fight for justice didn't conclude in a courtroom. The verdict was a victory, but it was only the first step in a larger battle, a battle for awareness, accountability, and healing. For Malik, it was about reclaiming his sense of safety in a world that had tried to take it from him. The legal aftermath. Patricia Myers was sentenced to 2 years in prison for her actions, a punishment that reflected the severity of her crimes but also ignited debates across the nation. Legal analysts dissected the case on primetime television, with some applauding the court's decision while others argued it set a dangerous precedent. Derek, however, had little interest in the noise. He was focused on what mattered most, ensuring that Malik could move forward without fear. Malik's school had become a second battlefield. News of the trial had reached his classmates, some of whom were curious while others whispered behind his back. Malik felt the weight of their stares, the isolation that came with being at the center of something so public. One day, as Derek dropped Malik off at school, he noticed his son hesitating by the car door. "You okay, champ?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. Malik looked down, clutching his backpack. "What if they think I'm different now?" Derek knelt down so they were eye level. "You are different," he said gently. "You're stronger, smarter, braver, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be your friend." Malik nodded, though his steps were slow as he walked toward the school building. Derek watched him go, his heart heavy but determined. He had to do more, they had to do more. The community speaks. The case had sparked an outcry, not just in their city but across the nation. Community leaders organized forums to discuss the larger issues of systemic racism and implicit bias. Derek was invited to speak at one such event, a gathering held in a local community center packed with residents of all ages and backgrounds. As Derek stood at the podium, he felt the weight of the room's expectations. He wasn't just a police chief tonight, he was a father, a role model, and a survivor of the same prejudice that had nearly crushed his son. "Justice isn't just about punishment," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about understanding, accountability, growth. What happened to my son didn't start with one person's actions, it's part of something much larger. And it's up to all of us to change that." He shared Malik's story, the pain of seeing his child suffer, and the hope he held for a better future. As he spoke, he saw nods of agreement, tears in the eyes of parents who had faced similar struggles, and the determined faces of young people ready to take action. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Malik, seated in the front row, looked up at his father with a mixture of awe and pride. For the first time in weeks, Derek saw a spark of light return to his son's eyes. Patricia's redemption? Meanwhile, Patricia Myers faced the reality of her actions. Prison stripped away her polished facade, forcing her to confront not only her circumstances but herself. Letters from strangers began arriving, some condemning her, others urging her to reflect. One letter stood out. It was from a woman who shared her own experience as a reformed racist. "Change isn't easy," the letter read, "but it's necessary. You have a choice now, to continue down this path or to rise above it." The words haunted Patricia. In the solitude of her cell, she began to examine the biases that had shaped her. She enrolled in programs offered within the prison, attending workshops on race relations and implicit bias. Slowly, grudgingly at first, she started to see the harm she had caused, not just to Malik but to herself and the society she was part of. Months later, she reached out to Derek through her lawyer. It was an apology letter, raw, unpolished, and full of regret. Derek read it carefully, his emotions a mix of anger and cautious hope. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," Patricia wrote, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I owe that to Malik, to you, and to myself." Derek didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness wasn't something he could give lightly. But he filed the letter away, knowing that change, even for someone like Patricia, was possible. Malik's growth. For Malik, the months after the trial were transformative. He began seeing a therapist, someone who helped him navigate the complex emotions he carried. Through their sessions, Malik learned to process his fear, anger, and confusion. He also began to understand that what had happened wasn't his fault, that Patricia's actions were a reflection of her own failings, not his. Slowly, Malik regained his confidence. He joined a youth mentorship program, where he met other kids who had faced challenges of their own. Together, they shared stories, supported one another, and found strength in their collective resilience. One day, Malik stood before a small group of younger kids at the program's weekly meeting. "I used to think being brave meant not being scared," he said, his voice steady, "but now I know it means standing up, even when you are." The room was silent for a moment before breaking into applause. Derek, who had been watching from the back, felt a swell of pride that threatened to overwhelm him. A legacy of change. The incident at the mall and the trial that followed became a catalyst for change in the city. Policies were implemented to address bias in law enforcement and public spaces. Schools introduced programs to educate students about diversity and inclusion. Derek worked tirelessly, using his position to push for reforms and bridge divides within the community. One evening, as Derek and Malik walked through the same mall where it all began, Malik paused by the bench where he had once sat waiting for his father. He looked up at Derek, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't feel scared here anymore," Malik said quietly. Derek knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's because you've grown stronger, champ, and because this place, this world, is changing." Little by little, as they continued walking, a man approached them, a stranger with a young daughter in tow. "Chief Reynolds," the man said, extending a hand, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it inspired me. It inspired a lot of us." Derek shook the man's hand, humbled but grateful. Malik smiled up at his father, his pride evident, a hopeful future. Months turned into years, but the lessons of that day never left Derek or Malik. They became advocates for change. Their story a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of standing up against injustice. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Malik turned to his father. "Do you think people can really change, Dad?" Derek thought for a moment before answering. "I think they can, if they're willing to try. And sometimes, it's stories like ours that help them see why they need to." Malik nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then I hope we can keep telling it." Derek smiled, pulling his son into a side hug. "We will, champ, we will." And together, they looked toward the future, not with fear, but with hope.